Let me welcome you all to our webinar today on post-COVID-19 world order, ? Are we looking at a new world order? Will we be looking at what we know already and what we've seen for a number of decades? We thought here at DIIS that this would be a welcome opportunity to address an important question at this moment. We are still in the middle of the pandemic. As you will see, I'm at DIIS today. We actually allowed into the building for the first time in 3 months, and I decided to celebrate this by having a physical presence at DIIS. But the pandemic, of course, is still ongoing. It's ongoing here and it's ongoing throughout the world. And so while it may still be perhaps a bit uncertain what will happen, some people argue that we already know the contours of the future world order. We'll look at what may happen and what we expect from this pandemic and how the world order will look and how it will be after the end of the pandemic. And I'm joined today by two speakers. I'll be moderating, and I'm joined by two speakers. One is my colleague, Lupeti, who specializes in Chinese affairs here at DIIS. And I'm joined also by Rasmus Søndergaard, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Lund University in Sweden. I should say that we are recording today's event. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. You can do this on your screen, and we'll see the questions as they pop up. You will have an opportunity also to give a thumbs up to the questions that you like, and they will be at the very top. So the more questions, the more visibility it will have, and I will try to manage the questions as we go along. We'll open with a conversation with our two speakers addressing Chinese policy and US policy within this overall framework of the world order, and then we'll take questions after that. I should say also that if you are watching the recorded version of this, you are not able to ask questions and you're not able to engage with the questions. You just have to sit back and relax and enjoy the questions asked by some of the attendees that we have here today. But let me introduce our two guests. I'd like to go first to Luke, who is my colleague here at DIIS. Luke, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks very much, Flemming. Great to be here.
Great. Thanks. Nice to have you. Perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourself, just say a few words about what it is that you do and what you specialize in. And I know you have a book coming up soon.
Yeah. Well, I'm a senior researcher at DIIS, and I've mostly for the last 5 years or so been looking at China's foreign and security policy. And in a book I have coming out later this year called How China Loses, I'm looking at basically how the rest of the world is responding to China's more assertive foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Great. And this is something we'll be discussing today, of course, also perhaps with a particular view to critical infrastructure, which of course has also been brought up, and dependence on alleged dependence on China for instance, technology, but also some of the items that were needed during the pandemic, for instance, masks and test equipment and so on. So thanks for joining us, Luke. And then I'll go also to Rasmus. Thank you also for joining us, Rasmus.
Thank you for having me. As mentioned, sorry, you want to?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I just wanted to introduce myself as
yeah.
Yeah, as mentioned, I'm a postdoc at Lund University. I specialize in US foreign policy in the late Cold War, and I specifically am interested in the role of human rights and democracy in US foreign policy. And I recently put out this book on the topic that I am contractually obliged to promote at any occasion possible. Then I've spent give or take 4 years in the US as a postdoc at Georgetown and a visiting scholar at Berkeley, and I worked in the US Congress for half a year also.
Great, and thank you for joining us. And your book, of course, which has just been released and which I recommend, of course, also deals with the topic which is relevant for today's discussion. So the historical legacy and the way that human rights, for instance, has played into a world order and how the US has promoted that. And we'll have an opportunity also to discuss that. We are standing, of course, in the midst of a pandemic, but we have other issues on the agenda as well. And Black Lives Matter demonstrations that we have seen in the US, of course, and elsewhere are important and may also influence, I guess, the voice that the US will be able to bring to this at a later stage. But we'll be returning to that. So with those words, let me welcome both of you, and let me welcome again all the people out there watching. Before we go into our discussion, I suggest to do a quick poll. I prepared a number of questions, just 3 questions for you out there to consider. And that will help us sort of focus our discussion, and we may take your answers also as a point of departure for our subsequent discussion. So let's take a look at the questions. So my first question is whether you expect a new world order after this pandemic. Do you expect it to be more or less the same, or do you expect that we'll see something different? We hear people, of course, arguing that this is the time to close the door. It's the time to close the door on the world order that we've known, and let's restart. Maybe we don't even have a choice. Maybe the world order is being defined for us. So do you expect a new world order? Second question concerns the pandemic and the distribution of power. Do you see any differences? And if there is a redistribution of power, how do you think that this has occurred? And then finally, on the post-pandemic world order, who will help shape that? Who will be in charge? Who will have the greatest amount of influence or power when it comes to the definition of the world order? And so I'll give you a few seconds to fill in your answers, and then we'll see what our audience thinks of these different questions. All right, let's take a look at the results. And we see that a small majority of people actually expect a new world order. And we have a group of people, about 1/3, who finds that it'll probably be the same. And we have a group of people also, like many of us, who are undecided and who find that this is quite a difficult issue to deal with. We have a question also on the distribution of power, the possible redistribution of power. See very few people believe in a redistribution of power which will favor the US. More people, 39%, find that it will be in favor of China. And then, of course, we have a third party or third parties. Now will be very interesting to discuss. There's an opportunity for us, of course, also to go into third parties, the European Union, for instance, or Russia, which is what I specialize in. And perhaps in the Q&A sessions, or when you ask your questions, if you're interested in discussing this particular topic, please bring something up, or if you have comments concerning a possible third party, that would be really interesting to see. And then we have a question of who will shape the world order as we see it after the pandemic. The US, apparently, so our audience thinks will not be in a position to shape this. Then we have China, and again, we have third party or third parties as a predominant one. So thank you for that. Let's go into the conversation, and let me start by asking you about world order, because we need to get a few definitions right, perhaps, or at least your opinion on this. And if I may go to you first, Luke, how do you see the present world order? What is it that we find ourselves in right now, and how do you see China's role in this?
Right. Well, when I was, I wanted to start off by quoting a late 20th century warrior scholar by the name of Michael Tyson. And for some of you who followed professional boxing in the 80s and 90s, he was one of sort of the premier fighters out there. And before one bout, he was famously quoted in saying, "Everybody has a plan until someone punches them in the mouth." And so Tyson said this in response to commentators talking about how his opponent's style will be, there will be technique, there will be planning, and they might beat Tyson's strength and speed. Tyson believed, often rightly, that with one punch, he could bring his opponent to the mat. So why does this quote help us to think about the present day world order? Well, I think because we do have international norms and multilateral institutions out there, and despite their flaws, they do function. And what we have seen, however, is particularly over the past decade, these norms and institutions have come under stress. They're being hit by body blows, I think, from both China and the US, but they've yet to be hit by sort of a headshot. So you can think about the market-oriented economic order, the World Trade Organization, for example. The US has quite some disdain for the US trade order at the moment under Trump. China, on the other hand, has been challenging international law of the sea, its militarization of the South China Sea. And we see both sides, I think, they're not using the norms and the institutions of the world to resolve their economic and political differences. So I think, you have heavy hitters both in Zhongnanhai and Beijing, where China's leadership works out of, and in the White House in Washington. And very quickly on China's point of view, I don't think they want to destroy this world order and build a new one. I think they very much want to take control of the current world order, adjust its norms and institutions to fit its political and economic interests. But in order to do that, they see themselves at least as having to drop their main opponent, which is the United States.
Okay. So you see China basically as a status quo power within the existing order?
Well, I think China does want to use this existing order, but shape it, change it, and to bring itself to the top of that world order. I think China, has a deep history of outside interference in its own affairs. It has a mistrust for the outside world, and particularly for colonial and neo-colonial powers like the US. And they therefore, at the same time though, China has benefited a lot from this world order, from free trade, from globalization. So China really wants to adjust things. And that could mean, for instance, we see, the human rights agenda in the United Nations being intervened on by China. We see China pushing more for its type of state capitalism to be recognized in international trade and investment. So it wants to reshape the world order.
Okay, so in a way, to sum it up, the building is fine, only they would like to rearrange some of the furniture.
Sure, but in rearranging the furniture, they're going to knock over some vases and other sort of precious pieces that other people in the house might like. Okay,
all right, thank you. Rasmus, the same question to you, but from a US perspective, how do you see the world order and what is the US role in this today?
Well, looking at it from the US, I think, polling also suggests that the Americans look at this slightly differently than our audience here today, for instance. And there is somewhat more optimism in the ability of the US to, you could say, bounce back or just keep itself at the top, especially if you look at Republicans. The conservative Republicans tend to strongly believe that the US is actually doing quite well when it comes to the crisis, and that the US also has the sort of foundational structure to remain on top. But I want to piggyback off of something Luke said, which I agree with, is that it's not just China that are rearranging the furniture, right? I mean, the US has for quite some time, and that this predates Donald Trump as well, has for quite some time been undermining the world order that itself have been constructing for decades. And there's plenty of examples, and really sort of peak US-led liberal world order, the way I see it, was really only in the 1990s. And since then, with the war on terror, the war in Iraq, etc., and of course with Trump now, you see plenty of examples of the US not really fully supporting the current world order. And so some of the blows that are inflicted upon it is actually also from the Washington perspective.
And where does this come from? What is the dissatisfaction with, again, and I'm sorry to keep up with this analogy, but the way that the furniture has been arranged originally? People usually say the Americans decided where it should be, but something happened, a process developed whereby they grew increasingly dissatisfied with that.
Right. So if we look at the present US-based world order as the sort of institutions that was set up in the aftermath of World War II, so the United Nations and the World Bank, the IMF, etc., they were set up obviously by the Americans in cooperation with their allies, but the purpose, of course, was to benefit US interests, defined in various ways in terms of international peace and stability, but especially also around creating American economic prosperity. So the dissatisfaction that you see also like in opinions, in public opinion in the US, is with this experience of the system not necessarily beneficiary to the United States or to average Americans at least. So that's the point, right? The system was set up to benefit American interests, and increasingly that is not always the way it's perceived from, especially not the sort of American heartland. Okay.
Let me just return to a thing you said earlier, Rasmus. You mentioned the U.S. perspective on this, and a recent Pew poll indicated that the Americans remain fairly optimistic when it comes to the world order. They think that regardless of how it's set up, and as you just indicated, there may be different views on this, of course, but they will be in charge. That the pandemic and of course also the U.S. handling of the pandemic and the current crisis that they face is not of such a nature that it will impair their ability to deal with this. Where does this optimism come from?
I mean, there are conflicting views in the US, you could say, as to the severity of the coronavirus and the necessity of shutting down society, for instance. I mean, the partisan debates that we've seen in the US over how to respond in the first place seems to indicate that at the core of it, there is not consensus on what is the challenge that coronavirus is posing the US and how should one react to it. I think the most interesting number there, the figure there, is that a question that's quite similar to the one that we posed to the audience, in which roughly half of Americans believe that China will be weakened as a result of the current crisis. And then quite few are saying the US, and others saying don't know, etc. So the point is that from the American perspective, the US is the one who stands to benefit from this. I mean, of course, opinions are vary slightly, but unlike the poll we just did, there is quite a bit of certainty that China is the one that's going to take the fall.
Okay, thanks. Let's bring this to Luke. Luke, we speak, of course, now about power and possible redistribution of power and the ability to influence certain developments and to shape, for instance, a world order. And during the pandemic, we've heard a lot about Chinese power, various types of power, of course. I'd like to focus on maybe one or two. One type of power that has been brought up quite a lot in relation to China, of course, is soft power, defined as the ability to sort of shape the preferences of others. But we also need perhaps to talk about normative power, so the ability to define acceptable standards of behavior. And if we go into some of this and we'll look at China and how they will emerge, the country will emerge from this, how do you see Chinese build-up of power, perhaps a loss of power, as Rasmus suggested, at least in the view of the US public?
Yeah, I would agree with Rasmus. I think, and the Americans polled, I think both China and the US don't come out of this pandemic looking better to the rest of the world. Both of them don't give you the impression that this is a country we want to emulate, we want to follow, that we will agree with on all issues. And for China, this we saw quite a fluctuation in sort of commentary on China's response to the pandemic once it did spread overseas. I think in the early weeks of the crisis, there was sort of a pile-on of commentators and academics who were claiming that now China was going to sort of win the global order because it was responding, it was taking the lead in the medical assistance and other forms of aid and support to countries around the world which were grappling with the coronavirus. But it really just took a couple other weeks until a lot of this sort of goodwill that China was trying to generate through its generous medical assistance, that goodwill really fell apart because China it provided this assistance, but it also sort of demanded that its viewpoints on the pandemic be sort of taken as truth, and that those including that the outbreak did not necessarily the outbreak of the coronavirus did not necessarily begin in Wuhan and Hubei province, but actually may have been sort of spread by the U.S. government, and these types of conspiracy theories So in particular, I think, if China was going to build significant soft power from its response to the global pandemic, it needed to have middle powers like the European Union, like Japan, India, agreeing with it on its side, cooperating with it, showing sort of international solidarity with its actions. And you really had, the exact opposite. You had the European Union coming out and saying there was a battle of narratives with China. Indian commentators also reacted quite harshly to China's sort of propaganda built around the pandemic. So really, it really wasn't a soft power victory for Beijing.
Okay. Even before the outbreak of the pandemic, of course, we talked about conditions in the Xinjiang region, and there was much international focus on the treatment of the Uyghur minority group, in particular in the Xinjiang region. Then, of course, it was the handling of the pandemic, it was disinformation, it was Hong Kong. Yet at the same time, recent figures, for instance, from the World Bank indicate that that China may actually emerge with positive growth in 2020. So despite a sudden economic collapse, of course, in the first quarter, they may actually emerge by the end of this year with modest growth, maybe 1% or so. And I guess the financial muscle, the economic muscle that China may still bring, irrespective of what happens with the soft power, could still be an important issue, I guess, if they can bring this to the table and they can negotiate and they can offer to finance infrastructure projects or else other larger projects in various countries that are in need of investment. So to what extent does the soft power actually matter here? If they still have the financial, economic muscle that they can bring?
Yeah, sure. Hard power matters, but I think it only matters when that actually leads to influence, and leads other countries to change their policies towards China, to be more open to China, for example. I don't know if China's economy will come out in the black at the end of the year. It certainly may do better than many economies around the world. But Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was just out the other day speaking about how large parts of the population, around 40% of the population, is still living under less than $140 a month. There's some concern within China that Beijing's goals of eradicating poverty this year may not be reached. China has a mounting debt problem at home. I think the amount in the piggy bank that it's willing to spread abroad in infrastructure is much more limited than it used to be. At least they're more risk adverse to spending that money, and we do see sort of a slowdown in its Belt and Road projects or projects, part of this infrastructure and trade initiative it has around the world. So I think that the ability of China to use its economic power is somewhat constrained by its domestic limits, but also by growing caution among other countries towards its investment in trade. You mentioned critical infrastructure. So some countries are looking to sort of disconnect themselves from some of these particular areas of critical infrastructure, areas, certain particular strategic sectors and supply chains. So we see sort of foreign investment screening laws being passed or being drawn up in Denmark, in Germany, in Australia, in India, in Canada, with China and to a lesser degree Russia on the mind of politicians. So I don't know how much China certainly will still be one of the perennial economic powers in the world, but its use of that power and how it translates into influence, I think, is still quite limited.
And this whole debate, of course, about critical infrastructure precedes also the pandemic, and we recognize this, of course, from the 5G debate that was quite strong even before this, and definitely last year, and it's been sort of picking up speed and it's become much more urgent and much more sort of pronounced. So do you see that the pandemic and the way that China has handled the pandemic, including, as you said, like propaganda campaigns, disinformation campaigns, has accelerated this development, this debate, and it's something which will actually work against China.
Yes, in a way, yes. I think, that there was, before the pandemic started, for example, we had a quite heated debate here in Europe about whether European countries should take on the Chinese telecom giant Huawei as their provider of fifth generation mobile networks. Networks that are really going to speed up and really drive connectivity within economies in Europe and around the world. So the question was, should you have a Chinese company, although it claims to be a private one, should you have a Chinese company building that infrastructure? And of course, the U.S. had a campaign to try to push its allies in Europe and around the world to block Huawei, and I really see that as quite counterproductive. We saw sort of very few examples of countries saying, positively standing up and saying, sure, we'll block them. They actually felt that was American interference, I think, in their own domestic affairs. But at the same time, there were a lot of questions raised towards Huawei because China does have this national intelligence law, which it passed in 2017, which basically obliges Chinese corporations to share intelligence with the Chinese government when it demands it, if there is a security issue, in very abstract terms. So I think because the pandemic brought on a lot of, I would say, critical and negative views towards China because of the way it handled itself, demanding that countries publicly praise its medical assistance, for instance, pointing the finger at the Americans for potentially starting the pandemic. That, of course, fed into these other debates and definitely gave more, I think, power to sort of hawkish views in European countries towards China.
Okay. Rasmus, Luke is now indicating perhaps part of the reason why China may not be in a position to influence the future world order as it would like to, and this is, of course, is also what was reflected in the perception that you mentioned earlier in the U.S. But if we take a look at the U.S. now, I mentioned China and Xinjiang and disinformation campaigns in Hong Kong. The U.S., of course, U.S. administration has also faced a number of problems. The handling of the pandemic, and then, of course, as we said in the introduction, also Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which have sort of, I guess, torn away also part of U.S. normative power, soft power. We see demonstrations throughout the world in support of the African American community. How serious is this for the U.S. ability to influence world events afterwards?
I mean, it's hard to be too conclusive once you're still in the development. But that being said, I mean, it is quite severe. It's quite apparent that there are, demonstrations on 3 continents in support of African Americans protesting against police brutality in the U.S. And the response from the White House has been something that you'd say mimics the authoritarian playbook with like law and order and strike down with great force, etc., and very little sort of concern with addressing the underlying structures and addressing the concerns of the American population. So of course it has a negative impact on the perception of the US abroad, and it undermines the Trump administration's ability to speak out against some of those human rights issues that you mentioned previously that takes place in China, for instance. The parallel, of course, with the demonstrations in Hong Kong seems like an apparent, like an obvious comparison. And yeah, this sort of, I mean, undermining the domestic, the US domestic situation undermines really its foreign policy in many ways, also with the response to the coronavirus. But say also with the coronavirus, I mean, the contrast to the way that the Obama administration responded to the Ebola crisis in 2014, where the US were active in sending doctors and etc. to Western Africa and sort of played a role in addressing this global health issue, in comparison to what happens now and Trump's sort of policy of America first, in which he makes it clear in no uncertain terms that he cares only about American citizens in relation to the pandemic and has complete disregard for global efforts to address this issue. that greatly undermines, of course, U.S. soft power abroad.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we need, of course, to look at the presidential election. It's upcoming, and it's important. It's important for all of us, and it may, of course, I guess, be influenced also by some of the events that you mentioned right now. So, if we have a change of presidency in the U.S., if Biden is the next president, will this change the way that U.S. handles some of these affairs? Will it change the way that the U.S. will look at the world afterwards? What is the difference actually between President Trump and his Democratic rival, Joe Biden?
Given that Biden spent 8 years as the VP for Obama, we have a fairly good assessment of what his foreign policy might look like, as opposed to other presidential candidates in the past who had less of an international role. So based on that, I mean, we can say quite a few things about how Biden is likely to approach these things. And some things are the same. Like, I mean, Biden so far in the campaign for 2020 has tried to outdo Trump in being tough on China. So there's not much indicating that US under Biden would somehow be softer on China, or that also in terms of the whole trade situation, of course, like the underlying dissatisfaction in American society with globalization and the trade situations with China will remain. So Biden will have to address these issues still. But there are obviously also differences, and primarily maybe in style of diplomacy. Biden is someone who enjoys doing diplomacy. He handled a lot of diplomatic relations for Obama as his time as VP, and he has connections with leaders all over. And he's someone who enjoys doing that part of the presidential job. So we'll see a president, I think, who's personally very involved in diplomacy and who values diplomacy and alliances, who will put an emphasis on multilateralism, who will, I imagine, take a new look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well, and issues like global warming, etc. Those sort of international issues that Trump has put in the bin. Those are things that Biden would pick up again. They also say, I mean, one last thing on Biden, I guess, is that he is very firmly a believer in this idea that the United States is a force for good in the world, and that for things to happen internationally, the United States needs to play a leading role. He has this sort of, you could say, a traditional liberal internationalist American approach to this idea that for good things to happen, the US needs to lead. And that is a very different view on the world than some of the Democrats on the left in the US, say Bernie Sanders, etc. So with Biden, all things indicate that we'll get a president that is much more committed to this sort of, you could say, the traditional American foreign policy consensus of alliances, on working with allies, on emphasizing international organizations, but still with skepticism and tough approach towards China, and also concern about free trade and the way that globalization is benefiting all Americans right now. Okay.
But even now, we've witnessed in recent months, in particular, of course, a rapid deterioration in relations between the US and China. And US President Donald Trump, of course, quite on the offensive with his tweets and comments and so on. So, is what you're suggesting, Rasmus, is that Biden will be even tougher, or?
I mean, you gotta always contrast what happens during the campaign and what happens if and when you're in office. But from what we have now during the campaign, that's the image that Biden is trying to convey, at least. Whether he will actually be tougher, of course, if in office, is a different matter. But I don't think that, I mean, there are issues in the US-China relationship that predates Trump, and whoever follows after Trump will have to address those issues as well. So I would be surprised if a Biden presidency would dramatically improve relations with China. They would be handled in a different fashion. But I think that the US will still continue with some of its attempt, of course, to oppose Chinese influence on the world stage, right?
Okay. Let me invite you also, Rasmus, to take a historical perspective, because this is also what you do. A lot of people argue, of course, when we'll look at the world order, particularly when we look at Chinese-US relations, perhaps, that what we are seeing now is simply something that was underway for some time. but it's an acceleration of it. That the pandemic and the international crisis and everyone fighting for itself, perhaps, is just a sort of reflection of something which we've seen before, which we've in a way grown used to. Do you agree with this view that this has been on the way for some time? And if you look at U.S. politics, U.S.-Chinese relations, and the way that the U.S. views the world order and how it should be set up, is this the sort of the culmination so far of a process that has been underway for some time?
Generally, yes, I agree with the assessment that this is an acceleration of existing trends, you could say. If you take them in two ways, I would say that one is this trend of the United States being increasingly critical of the world order that it helped establish, which is something we've seen from the Reagan era and also in the 1990s with opposition to the US funding such a large part of the United Nations, et cetera. And we have this sort of the US taking issue with the norms, for instance, on how to use force in international affairs, et cetera, undermining some of those values in its own system, you could say. And then on the other hand, also the relationship with China. I mean, yeah, I do see the pandemic and the Trump administration, the current affairs in the past couple of years, the trade war, as an acceleration of some of what we've seen in the past. I mean, obviously the Obama administration pursued a different policy in relation to TPP and another approach to containing China. But the sort of the confrontation or the way of rebalancing also from the Middle East, as Obama sought to do, and then to focus on China and Asia is something we've seen ongoing. And I think that is something we're seeing accelerating now. And I think also will continue to accelerate if Biden were to be the president. Okay.
We have a number of questions, but before I turn to the questions, and thank you for those, and please keep the questions coming. Luke, also, let me just ask you about this acceleration. Do you agree with Rasmus? Now, of course, he takes the US perspective, but is this something that has been people inside China have been waiting for? Like, again, we use this analogy of the building itself, and we need to rearrange the furniture, that now the time has come to set the furniture, to rearrange it in a way that you would like to, that it's sort of, it could have happened in a perhaps not so distant future, but this now is the time because of the pandemic. It has accelerated everything. Is that also a view that you share? Is it something that's been spoken of within China?
Yeah, firstly, within China, I do think they see, the presidency of Donald Trump and now the pandemic and the struggles that the US is facing as an opportunity to improve their own position in world order, their own power and influence abroad. For a long time, Chinese leaders followed Deng Xiaoping, a former paramount leader's advice of hide your strength and bide your time, meaning, build your internal capacity, and when you're ready, take this out to the world and show your influence then. And particularly under the current president, Xi Jinping, we've seen that idiom discarded, that sort of advice discarded. But this happened, I think, similar to former American leaders having more of sort of a assertive approach to China. Hu Jintao, the former Chinese president, had already sort of set the stage for a more sort of assertive approach in China's foreign policy. Sort of the foundation of the current Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's foreign policy signature, was designed under Hu Jintao's time. Some of the initial activities in the South China Sea were launched under Hu Jintao's second term in China. So Xi Jinping is sort of definitely accelerating China's sort of assertiveness, but he didn't start it. Now, I think when we talk about this acceleration question, though, briefly, we need to think about, where did we come from, and what's going to be this end destination, or what's the next destination, and I think it's important to bring in these third parties, to step away from this U.S.-China focus. Although the U.S. and China are, the two biggest powers in the world, this bilateral relationship is probably the most consequential one in our lifetimes. They're still sort of only part of a very vast picture. And I think often we fall into sort of this lens in the media and academia among business executives and government officials that only the US and China matter, and that our choices, foreign policy, business choices, are sort of shaped by choosing one side or the other. And a Singaporean academic and retired diplomat, Bilahari Kazakhan, he summed this up as a false binary. Sort of other countries having to sort of make this choice. He saw this between the US and China. He saw very much as really a colossal mistake for East Asian countries to make, because there is a third choice, there is a fourth choice, there is a fifth choice. There's a lot of things you can do. And you know, the Huawei decision for Europe is probably the most striking one of how this US-China mentality has taken control of our thinking. You know, because the pressure coming from the Trump administration to not go with Huawei, because the pressure coming from China for countries to include Huawei, European governments seem to be trying to make this choice between one or the other. The reality is, however, that Huawei's main competitors, Ericsson and Nokia, are both European firms, European telecommunication companies, and in many ways have higher competitiveness than Huawei. But yet European governments, particularly Germany, the UK, have often for the last couple of years been locked in this choice of either to go with Huawei or not to, and therefore side with the Americans, when has been and still is a European option right there on the table. And I think some European governments are now realizing that that might be the best one to take, but it took quite some time.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Let's open the question. We have a number of really interesting questions, and I'll ask you the first, Luke. It's from Kathy, and since you are Canadian, we didn't mention this at the beginning, but there's a question concerning Canada and Huawei. How do you see that? How do you see that controversy between Canada and Huawei? Doesn't specifically relate to what we're doing, but of course it has implications also for China's role. And you mentioned Huawei yourself. We talked about the 5G. How do you see that crisis between Canada and Huawei, between Canada and China?
Just some quick background. So the Canadians responded to an extradition treaty by the United States around a year ago. I may not have the date exactly right, to arrest Meng Wanzhou, who was a senior executive at Huawei Technologies and who was in Vancouver, Canada at the time. She is the daughter of the founder of Huawei, and therefore sort of an elite in China, a social political elite. So in response, around 9 days later, the Chinese authorities detained 2 Canadians living in China. And this has been widely seen in Canada and elsewhere as a direct response to the arrest of Meng. So now for a year, this court case has been moving forward. The 2 Canadians have been charged with a sort of espionage crimes. They have yet to be brought to court, however. And in the meantime as well, China applied trade sanctions against several Canadian agricultural goods. And we've seen the negative views towards China in Canada sharply rise. I think to around 70–80% of those polls have a negative view to China. So this has really damaged the relationship between Canada and China. I don't see it resolving itself anytime soon. I think China played its cards wrong here. They looked to punish Canada for something that the Americans started with the extradition warrant for Meng Wanzhou's arrest. And I don't think these relations will really improve until these 2 Canadians that have been detained in China are released. The trade sanctions are dropped against Canada. It's really at this precarious place right now because the Justice Minister in Canada can in fact step into this extradition case. And if, under the circumstances that Meng Wanzhou would be extradited to a country where she would face harsh treatment, I don't think he's going to be able to do that, not only because the US has a rule of law, has a court system that will process her, but also because the way China has acted in its response to her original arrest, the sort of the animosity that they've built up in Canada, make this decision by the minister almost politically impossible, not only being legally suspect. So I think Canadian relations with China, until these cases are settled, will continue to be quite poor.
Okay. Let me just take another question, Luke, also concerning China. This is from Abraham, and he's interested in Chinese handling of the pandemic. And he asks, quite wisely so, I think, well, we focus very much on the alleged mishandling, but even if they had handled this really, really well, would that suffice to sort of elevate China into a leading position? Or do we focus too much on the way that it has been handled inside China?
Well, it depends. You know, if we look at domestically, I think, you know, there were some, from everything we know, I think we're still, you know, getting the facts on what exactly happened in January this year. What did Xi Jinping know, and when did he tell the WHO about it? But there appears to be sort of a 1-2 week window where the Chinese authorities were very certain that this was a very contagious virus, that it was spreading human to human quite rapidly, and they did not inform the WHO. And this is what has brought on a lot of international critique. So, you know, I think if the Chinese would have responded quickly and told the international community earlier, yes, I think different research studies have found that the spread of the virus would have been significantly lowered. There's also sort of, you know, other information out there showing that the virus was already spreading in late 2019, and the argument made that it didn't matter what China did, it was already sort of out of the box, so to speak. But, you know, I think China could have, on the international level, definitely, I think, repaired the sort of negative feelings put towards it if it did respond in the way it did, providing medical assistance to others, but without sort of the propaganda that came along with it. I think that was a misstep by Beijing. And I think that going forward, we're probably going to see now a lot of discussions built up around new vaccinations and who's leading on vaccinations and how China might distribute those, or whether the US will develop them or third countries develop them, and that the politics around these vaccinations is probably going to be the next discussion we're going to be having, maybe, you know, late this year or early next year.
Okay. Rasmus, there's also interest from our viewers on how the US has handled this. And there's a question from Mark, for instance, who asks about how the Trump administration has dealt with this. And it relates back to some of the things we discussed about normative power, soft power. And you talked about this, of course, with the direct handling of the pandemic, the internal division when it comes to recognition of the pandemic also. But of course, also, as we talked about the Black Lives Matter, I may add to this economic forecasts, which are quite negative, probably a decline in US GDP of some 6%, perhaps just over 6% this year. Unemployment, of course, which is at a historic level. Where does this leave the US, and how do they pick up the pieces from here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, it's one thing is the health crisis, right, with the coronavirus, and what is it, 116,000 deaths by now. But of course, also the unemployment figures, like 40 million people unemployed, a quarter of the American workforce. It's a crisis of historic proportions, also in economic terms. And I think what needs to happen, of course, is some form of reckoning with the underlying weaknesses in American society that sort of predated the crisis, but have been sort of highlighted by the crisis. And I think there's a number here, of course. I mean, one is the economic inequality issue, which has been a big issue in American political debate pre-corona as well. And connected to that, also the access to healthcare. I mean, there are some big domestic policy issues on economic inequality and access to healthcare in the US. And those are issues that needs to be addressed if the US is to be better prepared for situations like these pandemics. And on top of that, then there's the whole political crisis, of course. Like, everything is a polarized question, and there's very little trust in authority and in government. And we've seen some of those countries that have handled the situation well, saying South Korea, Germany, Denmark, who have handled the situation well, in part because there's trust in government and there's support for the nation state and the authorities. And the US has a big issue there. So it needs to somehow reestablish a rapport between the population and government, reinstate some form of trust in the institutions and the political leaders. And that's a tall order, of course, but that's the big underlying problem that has been highlighted by the corona crisis. But also in general, it's like, if the US is to compete with China in an international community, I mean, it's sorting its domestic situation is the top priority.
Mm-hmm. Now, Luke mentioned earlier when we went over some of the issues concerning China that it appears now that to many people in the world, at least, that China is not a state to be emulated. And I guess the same could be said about the US as it is right now.
Most definitely. I guess that's why we see also that many people in the poll think that maybe a third party is the one that's most likely to benefit or to define the future going forward. Because, yeah, the US definitely has not done a good job recently of selling the US model. And if the economic projection that you mentioned as well is what we actually are going to see, then of course that the appeal of the American capitalist society or the American political economy will also take a significant hit. So yeah, there's a big problem there.
So let's go straight into it. We have a question from Paul, who asks about the third party, possible third party. And if I may ask you, Rasmus, first, who do you see? Do you see anyone to challenge the US? Do you see anyone to challenge China? Do you see anyone else, or a number of states perhaps, that may step in and help shape this world order?
I don't see a third party, but I think the question, in order to answer the question, you'll have to compartmentalize it a little bit. Because, for instance, I mean, look at international security and military affairs. There is obviously no alternative to US superiority at the moment. But if we look at other issues, say economic affairs and trade, there's at least the potential that the EU could harness its economic capacity and somehow mobilize a collective response to certain issues. I guess the EU would be a potential leader on economic affairs, but otherwise I would say these other global issues like climate change, etc. There are some of those issues where you can get far with diplomacy and international collaboration without the military power, where I guess other countries or other regional coalitions like the EU possibly could step in, but honestly, no, I don't see an obvious third party, which I guess is also reflected in the question in the first, and to begin with, right, that there's not a third country listed as the obvious third choice, because there is none.
Yeah. Luke?
I agree with Rasmus. There's not sort of a clear candidate, but there's not need for a clear candidate either. I think firstly, we don't need American or Chinese leadership to have world order. World order has always been about countries working together, a country sort of conforming to similar norms and objectives, even when it has been under American leadership. And we see, the consequence of that came about immediately after Trump came into power. He dropped very early on in his presidency, he dropped the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a very sort of modern free trade agreement that was made with Asian Pacific countries such as Japan, Canada, New Zealand. And Tokyo decided to take this up and rewrite it to a certain degree, freeze what the US was supposed to contribute there, but go ahead with it. And because of Tokyo's initiative, because of Shinzo Abe's initiative, they were able to sort of bring back to life the TPP, and it was signed, and it's moving forward as one of the most sort of progressive modern free trade agreements. You also see African countries, we haven't mentioned Africa today, moving forward with a pan-African free trade deal. You have Japan and the EU with their own free trade deal. You have the EU dealing with Mercosur countries in South America on a free trade deal. Where security is concerned, it's not just a showdown between the US and China in the South China Sea. Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, a number of countries have been sending in military ships or have been speaking vocally about China's militarization in that region. You see, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, other countries that want to maintain this rule of law in international affairs when it comes to maritime law. So I don't think we need a third candidate per se, but we do need to continue to have sort of common understandings around trade and around security issues. And I think, as Rasmus pointed out, someone needs to step up on these issues. It might be Japan economically, it might be the EU economically, it might be some of the Southeast Asian countries when it comes to security issues in the South China Sea, but someone needs to take the initiative.
So what you're saying, Luke, is that we may have a world order without a clear custodian, or it could be like collective effort.
Yeah, I think it's because it always has been collective effort. I mean, the US wasn't the only one that promoted human rights, and they often violated human rights in many countries in the Middle East, for example, and in South America. Many other countries wanted to advance these values. They were also values dear to them. You can ask Argentinians about human rights. It's also a big issue for them. These aren't values that the US created out of thin air after World War II. They're shared by many other countries around the world. At the same time, China is not the only authoritarian government in the world. There are plenty of other authoritarian governments that have been sort of, their legitimacy has been improved because of US foreign policy, because of China's rise, normalizing that political model. So this isn't going to be sort of a world where democracy necessarily thrives, but we could have sort of multiple orders within the world, one more leaning towards the Chinese way of authoritarianism, and others just leaning towards democracy still. Okay.
Thank you. We're running out of time. We need to wrap up. Let's just do a really quick question and quick answers. This is from Bartosz, and he's interested in the risk of war. So, Luke, your final comment?
The risk comes from accidents in the South China Sea and those escalating, because we have a lot of military action from the Chinese and the Americans there. And that's, I think, what will ignite the risk to war. Otherwise, I think and hope cooler heads will prevail.
Great. Rasmus?
Yeah, but I concur. I mean, misinformation, risks, mistakes, right, that could lead to it. I would say rhetoric plays a large part in, building up a hostile environment in which actions are likely to be misperceived as hostile, even if they were not necessarily in the first place. So there's all this talk about a new Cold War, for instance, I find quite disturbing in relation to the risk of military use of force. Okay, so we don't need to panic. We don't need to panic. Yeah, I mean, I guess they would paraphrase loosely FDR about having nothing to fear but fear itself. Like panic is what would lead us to panic. All right, great. Thank you. This is all we have time for. Thank you for joining us today. I was joined, of course, by my colleague, Luc Paty, and also by Rasmus Singh Søndergaard. My name is Flemming Splidsbol Hansen. Please join us again here at DIIS. You may also go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. Then you will get an automatic notification when we have webinars or when we open again, when we have our physical seminars, and of course also all our publications. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and hope to see you back soon.